While a raven lay with injured wings, the eagle soared to new heights. His feathers resplendent in the sun. He had taken to wearing the most exquisite uniforms, highly figured leather boots with gold hammered into the design, sheer white trousers, closely fitted and made in France of a tough, pliable cloth, an encrusted sword made in Spain and covered with gold and silver worth more than 7,000 American dollars, a flowing sash of Persian silk again woven with flecks of gold, a shirt of pure linen made in England, a handsome ruff about the neck, and over all a tunic of brilliant red adorned by many large medals including Mexico's New Order of Guadalupe, as big as a soup plate, and Spain's Order of Isabel la Católica, small but obviously more distinguished. Because he was inordinately vain, he had himself painted many times and photographed after the invention of the daguerreotype, so that we have a chronological record of his adult appearance over 6 decades. In not one representation does he look ordinary. Taller than most Mexicans and sharper of eye, he had an authentic imperial bearing, slim in his youth, statesmanlike heavy in his older years. His countenance was stern and commanding. As a young man, his face was thin and patrician, but the salient feature was his head of thick black hair, which retained its striking color throughout his life. He wore it in the attractive style of the early 19th century, brushed strongly forward at the temples and below the ears so that his face was always framed in black. But he was more distinguished for his overall bearing, which was majestic, than for any particular reason. He was entitled to half a dozen grandiloquent titles and insisted upon them when being presented to the public or when drafting one of his constant pronunciamientos, calling upon Mexicans to adhere to their ancient virtues and make the nation strong and peaceful. The title he relished most was one given to him by several cities, Benemerito de Tampico, for example, and Benemerito de Veracruz, which could be read, the one who is well deserving of Tampico or of Veracruz. He referred to himself as Benemerito in his public speeches, but also as the Eagle, a fortunate cognomen tying him to the flag of Mexico. Most colorful of all the nations, with a tricolor base of green for the beloved countryside, red for the blood of the heroes, and white for the purity of the Catholic Church. The center was decorated with a handsome depiction of the ancient Mayan fable explaining the settlement of the capital city. You shall wander until you see an eagle perched on a cactus devouring a snake. The embroidered eagle was stalwart, the snake writhed, and the rounded nopales of the cactus provided space for showing the names of the various states. Santa Anna intimated to his friends that he was the eagle on the flag fighting the battle against the snake of corruption. His crusade did not, however, extend to his personal life, for on the eastern outskirts of Jalapa, he had assembled a country plantation of gigantic size, Manga de Clavo, spike of clove, where he ran cattle innumerable and kept his wife and children in grandiose style. The precise maneuvers by which he had acquired his vast estate remain obscure. Expropriation, bribery, and theft all played a part, but the desired result was of awesome dimension. Like generals in all nations and all ages, he assumed that he was entitled to unusual privileges. In his case, they ran to hundreds of thousands of acres, millions of pesos, and a score of mistresses. Santa Anna was happy at Manga de Clavo, touring his holdings on horseback and indulging his passion for cockfighting. He had unquestionably the finest covey of fighting birds in Mexico and delighted in pitting them against upstarts in whatever part of the country he happened to be invading. But even so, Manga de Clavo did not entirely satisfy him, for it stood rather far out in the countryside. He therefore exercised his considerable powers of persuasion on the neighboring landowners and came up with an even finer establishment close to town, El Encero, a more refined home worth millions of pesos. He was happy in his married life, for he had found a perfect wife, a tall, thin, ungainly woman who brought him a dowry and respectability. Fortunately, she preferred staying in Jalapa rather than venturing into the maelstrom of Mexico City politics. Her husband could find no fault with this because it left him free to dally with the young women of the capital who found him irresistible. He already had 5 known illegitimate children circulating in political circles, with more to follow. Since he had now maneuvered a series of unbroken victories in battle, including a major victory at Tampico in 1829, when he repulsed Spanish forces sent from Cuba by Ferdinand VII to reconquer Mexico, in public he began to call himself the Napoleon of the West and had himself so painted, right hand jammed into his vest. In whatever house he occupied, he assembled memorials of that other great general, but despite his posturing, Santa Anna possessed some of the traits of an authentic military genius. He was never afraid to face real danger, although he did have a propensity for looking at all sides of an impending battle and withdrawing his troops if he felt he could not win handsomely. More important, as a congenital opportunist, he showed great skill at jumping in at the last minute when someone else had done fighting but he could claim the victory. The prevailing winds of Mexico's political climate continued to blow, during this period, even stronger toward federalism, and Santa Anna pragmatically continued to bend before them. In 1833, this gaudy, heroic chameleon became president of Mexico as an advocate of the three-part liberal platform whose supporters had been gaining strength since independence in 1821. A federal system composed of self-governing states, curtailment of the rampant prerogatives of the church, and the abolishment of special courts for priests and army officers. These federalist ideas were so appealing to the general population, which longed for real freedoms in order, that the state legislators elected him enthusiastically. Then began a mystifying quadrille. He did not like politics and abhorred the bickering attendant upon any national assembly. A soldier and by nature a confirmed authoritarian, whenever a difficult or unpopular decision had to be made, he relinquished the presidency, mounted his horse, and rode down to Manga de Clavo, where, like Achilles, he sulked in his tent until such time as the populace demanded he return to save them. Then he remounted, rode up the hilly trail to Puebla and on to Mexico City, where he was invariably greeted with vast parades, the firing of cannon, and the hosannas of the multitude, and was made president once again. After one such return, he was accorded a more expansive honorific, Benemerito de la Patria, well deserving of the entire country. In the 8 years, 1829 to 1837, while the United States was having only one president, Andrew Jackson, a man of rugged character who bound his nation more firmly together, Mexico suffered 7 different men chosen by due procedure, 10 who held the office temporarily while the president was absent or indisposed. This playing of musical chairs with the office of the presidency was the hideous penalty paid by most of the former Spanish colonies who were allowed to grasp their freedom before developing any theory of responsible government. Subservient to priests, bedazzled by generals, and confused by the swiftness of events, Mexico and the other former Spanish colonies sought refuge in the leadership of generals who had no keener sense of national destiny than did the muddled population. There were governments, many of them, but no governing, and since this fatal disease was so endemic throughout the Spanish world, Spain herself must stand condemned as a nation which had once possessed vast territories, had ruled them relatively well, but had failed to instill in them any capacity for self-government. The edgy Anglo-American settlers who were crowding into the state of Coahuila y Tejas were aware of this chaos and disturbed by it. If Mexico City can't govern itself, how can it govern us way up here? Residents in other parts of Mexico were equally distressed, and it was understandable that patriots should begin to think their nation could be governed only by some firm-minded dictator of benevolent heart. They apparently felt 11 times that Santa Anna fit this description. Whenever the going got rough, however, their hero's solution was to abdicate and sequester himself on his estates in Jalapa, giving his people the opportunity to see how poorly they fared without him. 4 times during the critical years when confrontation with Tejas loomed, June 1833, July 1833, December 1833, and January 1836, Santa Anna walked away from the presidency but always came riding back, once with a startling revelation which he tossed before the public without embarrassment. Although he confessed he had once backed with ardor and sincerity the principle of freedom for the people, now he saw this was folly. Realizing the people of Mexico were not yet ready for personal liberties, he concluded that despotism was what they needed. a despotism enforceable by him with wisdom and virtue. I now realize that I am a conservative, and I offer the nation a clear program which will save it. We must have a strong central government in which individual states enjoy few powers, and certainly not individual legislators. The Catholic Church must rule supreme, and the ancient privileges which priests and army officers once enjoyed must be restored. Reviving the battle cry of Religión y Fueros, again which he had once campaigned, he scuttled the liberal Constitution of 1824 and overnight converted Mexico into a theocratic dictatorship, and the citizens applauded. That is, most of them did. In the rich silver state of Zacatecas, a hotbed of federalism where men had relished their brief taste of self-government, they refused to abandon the Constitution of 1824 and mustered a militia to defend it. This was the kind of challenge that Santa Anna loved, for it presented him with an opportunity to escape the bureaucratic tangles of government, mount his horse, and charge off to do battle with a more tangible enemy. His reputation had been built on such affairs, and it was now about to be enlarged to the point of absolutism. This time, he would not enjoy numerical superiority. The Zacatecans had about 13,000 men under arms, while he commanded less than a third of that number, 3,500. The Zacatecans also outnumbered him in cannon and had good cavalry, but he had several tricks up his military coat sleeve. He intended ripping a page out of Napoleon's book and surprising the city's defenders with a surreptitious attack from the rear, which usually unnerved non-professionals. He also encouraged several of his officers to leave his ranks in apparent disgust, sneak into the city, and proclaim themselves defenders of the Constitution of 1824 and enemies of Santa Anna. As trained soldiers, they would be welcomed and given command of troops, whom they would lead to disaster when the fighting began. In April 1835, Santa Anna, 41 years old and at the height of his powers, assembled his military units at Aguascalientes, south of Zacatecas, and began a slow, determined march north. He reached the rebel city on the 10th of May and began an immediate assault early the next day that resulted in total victory, for the attack upon its rear and the defection of its newly acquired officers left the city unable to defend itself, despite its superiority in numbers. The aftermath of the battle reveals the savagery of Santa Anna's retribution. He turned his men loose in a wild, far-reaching rampage that burned part of the city, looted all of it, and killed some 2,500 women and male non-participants. One foreign official reported, "Our families became special targets, with English and American husbands slain and their women stripped naked and run through the streets." Zacatecas was punished for not having changed its mind as swiftly as General Santa Anna had changed his, and so the word went out. The same will happen to Tejas if it continues to clamor for the Constitution of 1824. When reports of the massacre at Zacatecas was filtered north to the Americans who had wandered into Tejas, thoughtful citizens whispered, "What might happen if Santa Anna marched up here to discipline us?" Their apprehension was merited, for an extremely ugly affair erupted in the port city of Tampico before the fires that had ravaged Zacatecas in time to cool. A band of some 150 motley adventurers, American and Mexican alike, convening haphazardly in New Orleans, concocted the idea of renting the schooner Mary Jane and sailing across the Gulf of Mexico to the post of Tampico, where freedom-loving Mexicans would be sure to join them in a revolt against the murderous tyranny represented by Santa Anna's sack of Zacatecas. It was a harebrained scheme, destined to failure from the moment the poorly navigated Mary Jane piled up on a sandbar at the entrance of the Tampico harbor. The accomplices ashore, relying upon help from the men now immobilized aboard the schooner, commenced their battle cries so prematurely that the local garrison had no difficulty in putting down the rebellion. 31 of the would-be invaders were captured by the Mexican forces, 3 wounded men died, the other 28 were lined up and shot. Frightened by the conjunction of Zacatecas and Tampico, the central government hastily enacted a draconian decree, the law of December 1835. Foreigners who invaded the soil of Mexico and took up arms against Mexico would, if captured, be summarily shot. Within half a year, application of this harsh law at the little Tejas settlement of Goliad would have devastating consequences.